welcome you all to the inaugural session of this new global media platform, Arctic Circle Virtual. And we are especially pleased that we have participants for this inaugural event from 40 countries and on every continent on the planet. The Arctic Circle Virtual, although launched in the times of the COVID pandemic, is not an outcome of that rather strange, challenging, tragic situation. It will become a permanent pillar of the Arctic Circle structure, in addition to the Arctic Circle assemblies, the Arctic Circle forums, and the Arctic Circle mission councils. The Arctic Circle Virtual will become a regular instrument for allowing political leaders, science leaders, business leaders, environmental leaders to engage in a dialogue with a global audience. And in a few weeks' time, we will add the fifth pillar to the Arctic Circle structure, Arctic Circle podcast, where we will provide the access to the extraordinary wealth of material that the Arctic Circle has collected over previous years. But we are today especially honored to have Senator Murkowski joining us from Alaska. She has been a very strong supporter and participant in the Arctic Circle from the very beginning. But now, in recent years, she has gained a global position, not just as a leader in the US Senate, but also as perhaps the most internationally recognized Arctic leader of present times. She joined us a few weeks before the American presidential election. And this is perhaps the first time in the history of the Arctic that the outcome of the American presidential election will have a big impact on the future of the Arctic. So these are indeed historic times. And as we all know, almost every day brings a new dimension to what I have called the high wire political act in the form of the US presidential election. But let us now go to Alaska and invite Senator Murkowski to present her opening remarks. And after that, I will bring in questions from many different parts of the world. Senator.
Ólafur, thank you for that introduction. Thank you for your leadership. It is indeed a pleasure to be with you this morning from Alaska. To all of our friends in Reykjavik, know that I miss this opportunity to gather on an annual basis. But we know that in these times of COVID, we are putting family and communities safety first and foremost. So we recognize that and hope you are well. To all those who are joining from truly around the world, thank you for this very important discussion and dialogue about the Arctic. It was just last year, Secretary of State Pompeo made some, let's just say, rather provocative remarks at Rovaniemi at the Arctic Council Ministerial, and while they were provocative, I think that they made an important and a very valid point. He stated that the Arctic no longer has the luxury of time. I left the Arctic Council meeting there and proceeded to yet another Arctic forum where another colleague made a point thereafter where he said that the Arctic cannot hang a do not disturb sign on the North Pole. And as much as we may wish to throw buzzwords around that the Arctic is a zone of peace, a region of cooperation and collaboration amongst the Arctic nations, I think we recognize that the rest of the world the rest of the world has discovered the Arctic, and they're either already here or they are coming. And this is with or without the United States, whether their presence fits our policy goals or not. So with that bigger picture in mind, you have asked the question, what impact will the US elections have on the Arctic? And I kind of wish, Ólafur, that the question was turned around just a bit. And the question might be, what impact will the Arctic have on our US elections? And perhaps there may be some impact. Obviously, questions about climate change, national security concerns, maritime shipping. But realistically, we know that the Arctic is probably not going to be part of these presidential debates. And given how the last presidential debate turned out, maybe that's a good sign. But I think it is fair to say that the Arctic is probably not what the people of Florida or Ohio or Arizona are thinking about when they go to the polls to vote this year. Maybe in the next presidential election, but not this year. So it's no surprise here to acknowledge that the current administration policies on the Arctic are considerably different than what we saw under the Obama administration. It is a very hard contrast in many ways. The Obama administration was almost singularly focused on climate change, and perhaps to the detriment of almost everything else, including the local economies. President Obama made an historic visit to the Arctic, came to Alaska during his term, and spoke about the dangers, the threat of climate change, coastal erosion on our communities, and moved from that photo opportunity to go back to Washington. And we didn't see that translate into hard action addressing the concerns and the threats. And then you have the Trump administration come in, and there's no pun intended, but you could not have a more polar opposite view when it came to the subject of climate. There is effectively no acknowledgement of climate within this administration. In fact, many within the international community suggest that we have gone backwards when the president made that determination to exit the Paris Accords. But the Trump administration, despite everything that you may see in the media, there have been positive advancements in the Arctic. They've chosen to take a different approach, I think, looking more and partnering more with state and local governments to address priorities. One example of this is dedicating support to Arctic infrastructure. We are finally moving ahead with our first deep water port in the Arctic, and that will not only help from a national security perspective, but more to the local communities and the local interests, help them to reduce the cost of living within that region. But as we heard again, Secretary Pompeo say at Rovaniemi, this administration has been much more focused on the national security element of the Arctic. But I think we have to recognize that US leaders have to appreciate, have to understand the enormous impact that climate has on the region and how it affects its residents in so many different ways. You cannot just scrub Arctic policy directives of the term climate change and suggest that we don't have to deal with this, that it does not exist. And while climate change cannot be the sole focus of an Arctic policy. It has to be recognized. It has to be considered in any comprehensive policy. And I think right now what we are seeing in the US Arctic is that the military are leading the way here. But I think that climate is driving the change in the defense posture. As you see more open water, you see more freedom of movement, you see more to protect. We have a competition for resources, for fish protein. And I think we are seeing the military certainly move into address the significance within the region. So I think it's pretty easy to forecast that re-electing President Trump would probably be a continuation of these policies focusing on national security. And then given Vice President Biden's role in the Obama administration, it's not difficult to see a return to those previous policies. Vice President Biden has outlined his climate plan, which is a pledge to return to the Paris Accords, working to reduce emissions, considerable what he calls accelerated investment in clean energy sources. But I would note that, again, the conversation that we're having here is not the impact of the election on US policy, but the impact to the Arctic itself. And I think as we get through this next month, we've got 1 month to go in these elections. With either result, we should be at a much better point further down the road, I guess, with regard to Arctic knowledge. We're not going to have to start over again in educating executive branch officials about the importance of the Arctic and what the hot topics are here. I think the region has become somewhat institutionalized within the US government bureaucracy. We shouldn't have a significant time gap as other nations wait for the US to engage. So I think that is a positive. During the Trump administration, again, we've seen considerable effort and resources provided to increase the United States physical presence within the Arctic. We've seen the opening of the US consulate in Nuuk. There have been increased joint military training operations. Recently, the coordinator for the Arctic region, Jim DeHart, was appointed. Just this past month, the Arctic Energy Office was reopened here in Alaska. This is going to focus on international cooperation in the space of science, energy, and national security. So I would think that our partners in the region should expect to see a continuation of these types of efforts and investments under a Trump administration. At the same time, we know that this administration has certainly shown greater willingness to act unilaterally around the globe. And I think that kind of puts these buzzwords of cooperation and collaboration at risk. I think a Biden administration would probably be less likely to act unilaterally in the region in the international sense. And so I think that is an important distinction there. But again, I'll kind of sum my comments here this morning with an observation that the Obama administration and the Trump administration have viewed the Arctic through two very separate lenses. It's either been climate or it's been national security. And so I have to ask the question, why is it either or? Why is it not and? Or why is it not just the word security? Security that encompasses everything, not just national security, but environmental security, economic security, food security, cultural security. These are the parameters that I think that we need to be looking at the Arctic. A comprehensive, truly holistic approach. I'm going to end my comments with just a reminder that we're focusing on the presidential election here, obviously very, very, very key to all policy. But it's not just about the presidency, it's also about the Congress. Depending on what happens with the majority in the Senate, it could impact support for ratification of the Convention of the Law of the Sea, something that I have advocated for quite some time. We haven't been able to advance that, but it also could have impact on congressional support for funding of additional icebreakers, Arctic infrastructure. And so I think it's important to keep in mind that as we're focusing with great interest on the presidential race, there is also a fair amount at stake when it comes to the Congress as well. So with that, Ólafur, again, it is good to be with you. It's good to be focusing on these significant matters and to engage in constructive dialogue. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much indeed for this comprehensive opening. And the questions keep on pouring in, and I think we should go straight into them following your opening remarks. And the first question, perhaps appropriately, comes from Greenland because President Trump definitely put that on the map, not just in America, but also internationally. So Malik Hansen from Greenland wants to know whether the outcome of the election will have an impact on how the US will invest in Greenland in terms of raw materials, exploration, and tourism, which probably indicates that the people of Greenland also have their economic interest in addition to the other political security interest.
Well, I appreciate the question, and it's one that is an important one. I mentioned the opening of the U.S. consulate in Nuuk. I had actually hoped, I think there had been several of us that had hoped we might be able to attend a ceremonial ribbon cutting about a month ago, but COVID restrictions prevented that. But again, that's very high on the list. There was a lot of discussion just last year at the Arctic Circle about a comment that President Trump had made about wanting to purchase Greenland. I think that that discussion has appropriately been put to rest, which is important. But I do think it is important. President Trump, as a real estate developer, knows the value of location, and he has acknowledged that Greenland is strategic from several different perspectives. It is well situated for environmental and scientific research, as well as hard security purposes. And I think Greenland should expect to remain a strategic partner with the United States, regardless of who the president is. In terms of cooperation, I look at this also from the Alaska perspective and recognize that we have a great deal in common, Alaska and Greenland, in sharing best practices in developing our economies, protecting the environment. We have not only geographical, but we also have cultural similarities there. So I think the quick answer to a very important and a very timely question right now is that the United States should, as they do now, view Greenland as a partner on a host of different levels. And my hope, my desire would be that would just continue. I do think we recognize full well that there are others who are also looking at the opportunities that Greenland might present from a resource development perspective, and how we can help support Greenland in efforts to address their economic issues are things that I would want us to continue to support.
You mentioned in your opening remarks, you mentioned security as one of the fundamental aspects. And we have a question from Professor Bertelsen in Norway, a very active participant in both the Arctic Circle as well as other Arctic fora. And he refers to your Ted Stevens Arctic Center for Security Studies. And the core of the question is whether that platform could be a forum for circumpolar Arctic military security and arms control discussions with Russia.
It is a question that I really appreciate, because I did not raise in my comments the initiative that I have embarked on, which is to establish an Arctic Securities Studies Center. The United States has currently six studies centers around the world. People might be familiar with the Marshall Security Center, but we do not have a security study center that is focused specifically on the Arctic. And it is, again, it's 1/4 of the globe that we're basically overlooking when it comes to a holistic review and understanding of security within this region. And so the question as to whether or not the Ted Stevens Arctic Security Center might be able to be just this entity to focus on the security aspects is a good one. And it's one of the reasons that we are helping to establish this. We've got legislation underway. We have not yet accomplished this through the legislative bodies, but we are developing support. So I think the short answer is absolutely yes. You'll remember, again, I've referred to Secretary Pompeo a couple times now already, but there has been a great deal of discussion since his comments on whether or not the Arctic Council should include military and national security issues within its portfolio, something that it's restricted from doing right now. I personally don't support expanding the Arctic Council's jurisdiction to include these topics. I think that that doing so binds the Arctic Council's ability to do the good work that it has done. Personally, I don't think that the council would have achieved as much as it has with the agreements that it has with the oil spill preparedness agreement, the search and rescue agreement, the scientific cooperation.
Can I just?
I want the council to continue the collaborative work that they do. So I think we stay out of that.
Can I just stop you there, Senator, because we
Yes,
have got a question exactly on the Arctic Council from a member of the British Parliament, Douglas Chapman. And he wants to know, in the light of the upcoming chairmanship of Russia in the Arctic Council, and it's only about half a year or so until Russia takes over the chair of the Arctic Council, how will the US-Russian relationship function with Russia for the coming 2 years, being the leader of the Arctic Council? I'm sorry I interrupted you, but I wanted to bring that question directly to your comment on the Arctic Council and your discussions with Secretary Pompeo.
Well, I think it is an important one, and we're all anticipating Russia's chairmanship of the Arctic Council next year and what that might mean. I think we recognize that our tensions right now, our political tensions with Russia are certainly heightened in several areas. But again, can we have the level of cooperation and collaboration in the region that we need? And so the question, who is best poised to do that? I note that in Vice President Biden's climate plan, he has placed climate change as the top issue for the Arctic Council. It may be that Russia is not so focused on putting climate change as the top issue before the Arctic Council during their chairmanship. I think it is very apparent, not just within our country, but globally, that President Trump and Mr. Putin have areas that they are able to converse and speak about, and other areas where I think it's fair to say that you've got a pretty toxic relationship. And so when you think about the role of the Arctic Council and its leadership on these areas where, again, you're trying to find cooperation, it may be a challenge in a Trump administration on some of the Arctic priorities. It may be a challenge.
Well, it certainly will be fascinating to watch. And if I understand you correctly, you seem to hint that the relationship with Russia as the chair of the Arctic Council will vary depending on which candidate will actually win the election. But there is another major player on the international scene, and that is the European Union. And we have a question from Denmark. Mats Fredriksson asks simply if the European Union plays a role in the U.S. Arctic policy, and what it is.
Well, I do think the European Union plays a role in U.S. Arctic policy. I think that again, our policy as an Arctic nation has to recognize and acknowledge the participation, if you will, through commerce, science, through environmental, national security issues, that we need to be factoring in nations all around the world. I know that this administration has said that you only have Arctic or non-Arctic states, and that is physically true. That there are those that have land and territory above the Arctic Circle, and there are not. But we also recognize that the interests globally are not confined to just Arctic nations. And I think this is especially true as we're seeing the impacts of climate change and greater movement in the Arctic than we have ever had before. And so again, whether we like it or not, there are interests that are non-Arctic interests that play in how we establish our policies, how we are inclusive, and how we recognize the role that others play. We see it. We certainly see it when it comes to aviation and travel through the skies or through space. One would think we would see it through our oceans as well.
Well, then of course we have NATO, and we have a question from Australia for you. Elizabeth Buchanan wants to go further into this discussion of climate change strategy, sort of from Washington, especially with respect to the U.S. Arctic agenda, and whether the U.S. as a NATO member sees a role in this respect or not. You have talked a lot about the climate change difference between the candidates. So maybe if you can focus on whether you see any role for NATO in this area.
The question is when we might see it. That that is difficult to predict. That may have a lot more, we'll have a lot more clarity on that after the election. When we think about the role of NATO and the U.S. participation with our NATO allies as it relates to Arctic initiatives, we've seen increased joint military training between Arctic and our Arctic partners and NATO. In terms of NATO and climate and the role that we will play, I wish that I could give more clarity to it, but I believe that if we have a second Trump administration, climate will not be part of that U.S. Initiative, or at least not framed in the view of climate. Again, you think about what some of the things that we've been doing. We've got some significant Arctic strategies that have recently come out through the Department of Defense. We had an Air Force Arctic strategy released just this summer that for the first time, it's an Arctic strategy that actually acknowledges the role that traditional knowledge coming from indigenous peoples in the Arctic actually plays. To me, that's significant. And so
we have a lot of questions. We have a lot of questions coming.
Okay, all right, I'll try to be quick.
From different parts of the world, and maybe since we are coming towards the second part of the second half of the time that we are allotted, maybe we could run through these questions and get perhaps short answer to them.
Okay.
The next question comes from your own country, the United States. If Biden wins, whether the current initiatives with respect to oil and gas drilling will actually continue. What is your view about the difference between the Trump administration or the Biden administration in that respect?
Well, Vice President Biden has made clear in his climate policy that he would halt drilling within the ANWR region. This is despite the fact that there is support, local and state support for responsible development within ANWR. He's also indicated that there would be no new development of oil and gas in the Arctic on public lands. Well, not just in the Arctic, but on public lands. So in terms of the differences, when it comes to resource development, they are pretty far afield. President Trump has opened ANWR to limited exploration and development, and Vice President Biden has made clear that he would halt that.
In this respect, we also have a question from a member of the Scottish Parliament about the role of Scotland and Alaska in the oil and gas industries, and whether that will have an impact on the solution of climate change solutions. So if you could perhaps also comment on this from a perspective of Alaska or Scotland in this respect.
Well, first, I want to acknowledge that the trip that we made to the Arctic trip that we made last year with a handful of other senators that included a stop in Scotland. We went to the University of Aberdeen. Some of the developments that we are seeing there, the technologies that are being utilized for carbon capture, utilization for management of carbon waste, I think are not only exciting, but they have potential to have dramatic impact on the ability to allow for production of fossil resources without the carbon impacts that we are dealing with and that we recognize that we have to deal with. So I see a great deal of partnering with Scotland, recognizing and other nations like Scotland that are really seeking to pioneer and advance in these areas, particularly as they impact an oil and gas industry that knows that it needs to work to address the emissions, or you will have a situation where you have workers in an industry for which you have no industry anymore.
Though we already had a question from Greenland, I'm going to take in this question as well. It is on a sensitive issue which matters a lot to the people of Greenland. And it brings up the issue of the Thule base and whether the original inhabitants that were forced to relocate because of the Thule base, whether they could expect an apology from either the Trump or the Biden administration.
I know that there are many within the administration, the current administration, again, that are working to develop a relationship with Greenland that goes beyond Thule Air Force Base. And I think that that's important because for so many years, the interest and the relationship was just strictly with the airfield and how that could benefit the U.S. from a strategic defense perspective. I think there is, though, a recognition that the people of Greenland are part of that relationship, and a recognition that when the United States came in and directed a removal, if you will, and I don't know that directed is the right word, but the inhabitants were moved from that area to accommodate this Air Force base. So I think that there is a recognition that Greenland is more than just that defense launching pad, that it hosts native peoples who live and work and raise their families there and have for generations and generations, and how we respect them is important.
I think it shows the importance of Greenland in the new American Arctic policy discussion. But we also have a question from your own country on Greenland. And it's a question which highlights the strategic importance of Greenland and asks whether the Trump or the Biden administration should have a position on Greenland becoming independent from Denmark. And this comes from Robert Hiss, who was the past president of the Camden Conference on Foreign Affairs.
And I can't speak to where Vice President Biden may go on this. I haven't really, again, there hasn't been much discussion in this presidential debate on any matters related to the Arctic, unfortunately. In terms of Greenland's independence, I think that there is that recognition that Greenland, in its efforts to stand alone, needs to have some level of economy in order for its citizens to be able to care for themselves, absent the support that they have received from Denmark. And so how these local economies can be built is something that I think the United States, I think this administration has interest in. Recognizing, again, you have very sensitive environmental concerns in a place like Greenland. So when we think about the resource potential, how we are able to develop it with a sensitivity to the environment, I think has to be a key consideration. But that independence can't really come unless you have some ability for your own economy.
We have not spoken very much about the Asian countries, but we have just got in a question from India, which asks about what is the role that the US sees for India or China in the Arctic Council. We have increasingly, as we have discussed, seen the growing importance not only of China, but Japan and Korea. And I was in India at the beginning of March and had discussions with various members of the government of India. And it's clear that India is taking a new interest in the Arctic. So if I can invite you to make a comment, not just on China and India, perhaps also in a broader context on the role of Asian countries in this.
Well, I think you would have, at least from this administration, they would repeat the assertion that you're either an Arctic nation or a non-Arctic nation. And so China's assertion that they're a near Arctic nation shouldn't afford them any special priority, at least with China's intention within the Arctic region. Again, I think this just goes to my initial comments about others who are viewing their interest in the Arctic, their role in the Arctic as being a global role. And so how Asian nations can be afforded observer status in the Arctic Council is one that we have taken up before, continue to. I think when you think about a country like India, its significant population, its significant role in global commerce, it of course should be part of these broader discussions, and what role they may play in Arctic Council again is something that when we talk about observer status and what that really means, these are important discussions to be having.
But I think the paradox for the Trump administration, giving the view on China, as you have mentioned today, the government in India, the Modi government, is clearly in big favor and being favored by President Trump and Washington. You have Japan and Korea that are major US allies in Asia. So you might see increasingly within the Arctic platforms, whether it's the Arctic Council or the Arctic Circle or other platforms, these key Asian states for the US global position, India, Japan, Korea, are exerting themselves in the Arctic in a way that we have not seen before.
And that's why I think, if I may interrupt, that's why I think the Arctic Circle forums that you have hosted over the years have been so important. We were going to have one in Tokyo this summer, or next summer, excuse me. Yep. And recognizing that how you are helping to facilitate, again, these broader conversations, I think has been extremely important to how we shape and how we move forward these policies.
Well, I think this dialogue has demonstrated very strongly, and thank you very much, Senator, for how you have illustrated it with so many examples, the new geopolitical significance of the Arctic. When we first started talking about the Arctic years ago, and I first came to Alaska, the prevailing view that this was a peripheral part of the world, and it didn't really fit in any platform of geopolitics. But I think your inaugural presentation and the dialogue you've had with people from different parts of the world today demonstrates that the geopolitical significance of the Arctic will continue, whoever wins the American presidential election. Of course, we have seen President Trump put forward particular emphasis in his Arctic policies. And the Biden administration would perhaps be a greater question mark. But the geopolitical realities of Russia, the other Arctic partners, of the increasing interest of the European Union, the growing importance of the Asian countries, even allies of the United States in Asia within Arctic platforms, as well as new sea routes, access to resources, and of course, the Arctic as the front line of climate change. All of this means that the geopolitical role of the Arctic in the coming years is a new era for the Arctic. So thank you very much for being with us here today, for agreeing to inaugurate this new media platform that the Arctic Circle has launched. We wish you well in your challenging endeavors in Washington. We have not discussed those aspects here today, but all your friends and those interested in your role in the Arctic and those who look forward to your continuing leadership, of course, watch with great interest and admiration how you have managed to perform these multi-challenging positions that you have to deal with every day. So thank you very much for inaugurating the Arctic Circle Virtual. We will close with a video which introduces the next Arctic Circle Virtual program, which will concentrate on the historic and extraordinary expedition that has been, for the first time in human history, for 12 months in the Arctic. And we will have the leaders of that expedition speaking to the global audience in the same way as you spoke here today. And that will take place later this month. And then in the coming weeks, we will also have the Arctic ambassador of the European Union being able to discuss the evolving European Union Arctic policy with a global audience in this way. And there will be other Arctic Circle virtual programs coming in the coming weeks and months. So thank you very much, Senator Murkowski. Thank all of you from more than 40 countries in different parts of the world, in every continent on the planet, for having been part of this inaugural event. And we will close with the introductory video on the MOSAiC expedition. Thank you.